Hello, dear friends. I recently came across this wonderful book, The Golden Age of the Samurai, where we can explore Japan's elite warrior culture. I got excited when I saw this book and its wonderful presentation. Japan and its history and culture is something I am a huge fan of. It's my favourite nation I have yet to visit, I often like to say. So hopefully one day I can visit the locations mentioned in this book in person, which would be lovely. But let's have a look, shall we? It's a lovely looking book, beautifully presented. We've got the unification of Japan, battles of the samurai, weapons and armour, myth and reality, social structure, and the end. So lots of juicy content for us to explore together. The period of Japanese history between 1550 and 1615 is often considered something of a golden era for the samurai. It's when the warriors reached the zenith of their powers and united the country under the sword. We have here a 14th century scroll depicting a dramatic battle between Minamoto and Taira samurai at the Rokuhara mansion in Kyoto. And here we have early samurai combat consisting of a mounted archery duel between two warriors of equal rank. A sword fight on the ground would often follow. So they seem very intertwined here. It's almost like a wrestling match. The sword would later become the mighty katana, often called the soul of the samurai, considered a spiritual extension of the warrior himself, and it was a masterpiece of sword making. The genius of the blade lay in its bimetallic makeup, a hard cutting edge wrapped around a soft, flexible core. The katana would only leave the samurai's side in death, and even after the warrior order had ceased to exist, the sword continued to be a symbol of the samurai ethos. Bushido, or way of the warrior, was the samurai's code of ethics that enshrined loyalty, honor, fearlessness, honesty, and self-sacrifice. Brave warriors would display their Bushido virtues on the battlefield or die trying, and any samurai defeated in battle was expected to commit seppuku, or suicide, by slitting open the stomach as a matter of honor. Here we have the Battle of Uji, which signalled the start of the Genpei War between the Minamoto and Taira clans. And here Naginata-wielding warrior monks stop the Taira from crossing Uji Bridge. And here is Kusunoki Masashige's statue, which stands guard outside Tokyo's Imperial Palace. Masashige immortalized himself by leading an army into a battle he knew could not be won. It's an incredibly dramatic statue, isn't it? The motion is wonderful. There's two ronin battling it out in the snow, and ronin were masterless samurai or wave men destined to wander aimlessly like the waves in the sea. And here is a fantasy scene showing the last samurai, Saiko Takamori, committing seppuku as American gunboats approach. In reality, Takamori died on dry land at the Battle of Shiryan. It's always a fascinating time as well, where this time of great honour and principle, Bushido, met with external foreign forces that had firearms and weaponry and greater look at that there. Seppuku, often known more coarsely as harakiri in the West, is considered one of the most painful possible ways to die. The bravest samurai were those who made the longest open cut and let their viscera hang from the wound. And as such, a samurai about to perform seppuku was allowed to have a second waiting nearby to behead him at the crucial moment and end his suffering. Seppuku manuals suggested leaving a flap of skin on the samurai's neck to prevent his head rolling away or hitting an official. having a manual for seppuku is very interesting. And with the deterrent of seppuku to keep bored samurai in check, it was suggested that they spend their time on more cultural pursuits such as tea ceremonies and calligraphy. But in reality, many samurai struggled to survive and were forced to take up part-time jobs trading bamboo or making umbrellas. And some even sold their swords or replaced the blade with bamboo to keep up appearances. Here's Saigo Takamori's grave and Nanshu ceremony in Kagoshima. Takamori's last charge against modern weaponry from the west spelled the end for the samurai. And great emphasis was placed on the importance of tea ceremonies during Japan's Edo period. With no wars to fight, warriors were encouraged into more cultural pursuits. So I don't want to read too much into these introductory elements because I believe the chapters themselves will explore each of these sections in more detail. So we start with the unification of Japan. Beautiful there, the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu's famous golden pavilion was equalled only by his palace of flowers that was twice the size of the emperor's palace. And here is the Ashikaga shogunate, which reached its zenith under Yoshimitsu, who solved the country's two-emperor system. After Yoshimitsu, the Ashikaga fell into a slow decline. So Japan's so-called golden period that unified its provinces and led to 200 years of peace under the Tokugawa regime followed centuries of violence and civil war that left the country divided and leaderless. So the trouble began in the mid-15th century, when Ashikaga Yorimasa, a weak and decadent shogun, all but renounced his post, opening the way to the strongest contender. Those who sought power were the daimyo, warlords who ruled over the clans and provinces of Japan. Their fight to unite the country under one central ruler would see Japan splinter further into warring regional factions, and eventually lead to a fundamental shift in the country's political model, as those with the greatest military might won out over those born with an aristocratic title. The movement even had a name, Gekukujo, or the low overcomes the high, which meant for the first time in samurai history, the low-born man could find his way to the top using his brains and brawn alone. And those who achieved this did so with alarming speed and brutality. Among them are the three characters central to Japan's history: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Of these, Hideyoshi, the one-time sandal-bearer and foot-short soldier who united the provinces, best represents the Gekukujo ideal. Gekukujo was only made possible by the slow decline of the Ashikaga shogunate, which ruled from the imperial capital of Kyoto. And the Ashikaga had been pivotal in ending a period of war and confusion, when two emperors, one in the north, one in the south, ruled Japan at the same time. Although the emperor was supposedly picked according to a mandate from heaven, the regional samurai clans found that they had to swear allegiance to one of the two. So an era of regional clashes predictably followed, as both emperors vied for control. Clans learned to change sides whenever it suited their needs. Sometimes neighbouring clans staged mock battles in which no blood was actually spilt, while their mock reports recounted great enemy numbers and heroic fighting on either side. Here is also Kaura Katsumoto battled against the Yamana clan in the inconclusive Onin War. Kyoto was razed to the ground during the conflict. And here is the shogun, Ashikaga Yorimasa, who was more interested in indulging himself than maintaining order. His silver pavilion, an imitation of his grandfather's golden pavilion, was never completed. Bit symbolic going for silver over your grandfather's gold. So as the country descended into regional conflict, the biggest losers were the low, the peasants. So instead of dealing with one imperial official or tax collector, the peasantry often had to suffer two, one from each emperor, and their anger soon erupted into protests and revolts. In 1392, a cunning Ashikaga shogun called Yoshimitsu settled the two-emperor issue by ordering a system of alternate rule. In reality, the southern emperor never got a turn, which suited Yoshimitsu, who enjoyed a relationship of mutual admiration with the Northern Emperor in Kyoto. Yoshimitsu cut a curious figure as shogun. He improved trade with China, built the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, and supported the arts and cultural traditions such as tea ceremonies. He also did what a shogun should. His Shugo military governors largely kept the peace in the provinces and collected revenues for the imperial coffers. Not all of Yoshimitsu's successors were made up of the same stuff. If Yoshimitsu represented the high watermark of the Ashikaga clan, his descendants only left a grimy ring. The worst of all was Yoramasa, who became shogun in 1443, at 7 years of age. So from the start he was a reluctant and uninterested ruler who collected taxes only to indulge himself in various artistic pursuits. It would have been of little concern to Yoramasa that under his watch provincial clans were building strong and powerful armies and becoming almost completely independent from shogunal control. Under Yoramasa, it was only a matter of time before a serious conflict broke out between two or more vying clans, and it was of course the shogun's role to keep the peace and prevent provincial struggles, but instead, Yoramasa pawned off his armor to pay his entertainment bill. The shogunal hold on Japan was soon to slip completely from the Ashikaga grasp. So we now move into the Sengoku period, which, considering the increasingly ineffectual rule of the Ashikaga, it's perhaps fitting that the Sengoku Jidai, or the Age of the Country at War, began with a dispute over a succession claim to the Ashikaga shogunate. As the dispute boiled over, samurais from the two houses at its heart, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, met each other to wage war in the capital itself. Citizens of Kyoto fled the city as samurai took over homes, dug trenches across streets and began a series of raids on enemy dwellings. The conflict known as the Onin War lasted 11 years and reduced Kyoto to a pile of blackened burning rubble. By the end, the samurai themselves moved away from the former front lines of the city centre, and gangs of robbers, looters and other opportunists moved in. It was said that Ashikaga Yoramasa held poetry readings and tea ceremonies as the city fell around him. But even after the fighting in Kyoto had played itself out, the disease of warfare had spread to the city's outlying districts and into the provinces. Now the provincial samurai clans, who had been quietly power building for nearly 200 years, were seizing the chance to use their military training. And the head of each clan was the daimyo, whose main aim was to hold control of his domain and conquer the jurisdictions of others. And the final prize was of course the shogunate itself and the chance to rule over all of Japan. During this period, some samurai clans were simply wiped out, while other smaller factions were obliged to join forces to stay alive. The nature of warfare itself changed in the Sengoku Jidai, and romantic notions of mounted duels and battlefield decorum became as rare as aristocratic samurai leaders. Marching in to replace them were common foot soldiers, the Ashigaru, armed with matchlock arquebuses. And the Ashigaru would become the mainstay of samurai clan armies, and clever daimyo would go to great lengths to keep them happy. They depended on both the produce from the peasant fields in peacetime, and their presence on the battlefield during periods of war. Disaffected Ashigaru could and did show their displeasure by leaving to fight for a neighbouring daimyo. Other unhappy commoners could join a union called the Iki. The protesting peasants of the Iki first marched against the rice merchants and moneylenders who had grown rich from their labour. Groups of Iki who followed a sect of Buddhism called Jodo Shinshu, or the True Pure Land, were known as Iko-Iki. The Iko-Iki became the first commoners to overthrow the samurai clan of the Kaka province and rule in their place. These Iko-Iki, upholding the ethos of Kekukujo, would prove to be a military force equal to those of the mightiest samurai daimyo in the years to come. Here's Usugi Kenshin, who was a distinguished daimyo whose gentlemanly methods of combat would become completely outdated during the Sengoku Jidai. Here's waging gentlemanly war. So the Battle of Kawanakajima was an annual event fought between Usugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen. Both daimyo would ensure the battle ended in a draw. So two of the early Sengoku Jidai's most colourful daimyo were Takeda Shingen and Usugi Kenshin. They represented the last of the gentleman warriors who conducted their warfare according to the honourable traditions of old. So every year for 5 years in a row, the armies of Kenshin and Shingen met in the same place on the plain of Kawanakajima to do battle. Sometimes when one army had gained the upper hand, it would withdraw as a sign of respect for the opposition. And when Shingen's salt supply was cut off by Kenshin's ally, the Hojo clan, Kenshin sent Shingen a supply of salt from his own stock, commenting that he fought with swords, not salt. Interesting. So at the other end of the social scale, things could not be worse. As the samurai clans fought for supremacy in the provinces, the lives of the emperors and shoguns in the capital were difficult. The emperor simply had no money. The revenue from 250 landholdings across Japan before the Sengoku Jidai had shrunk to only 34 landholdings during the Warring States era, and as such ceremonies became modest and seldom held affairs. Palace gardens grew unkempt. Some of the emperors had to sell their private art collections. When Emperor Go Tsuchimikato died in 1501, there was no money to bury him. His successor was only able to hold his coronation with a cash gift from the Iko-Iki, so the finances of the shogunate were no better, and the shogun, like the emperor, became a mere figurehead. By the mid-1500s, Japan had become chaotic and consumed by an endless series of regional battles. There was no central power. It was only a matter of time before a warring daimyo would judge himself strong enough to march on Kyoto and seize control. Here is Oda Nobunaga, who was a brilliant and ruthless general who put thousands of innocents to the sword during the unification of Japan. He was a formidable opponent in battle, but it wasn't until he adopted the arquebus that his army became an unstoppable force. Wonderful image there. So dramatic, these paintings. It's characteristic of the Gekokujo tradition, at the age of the first great unifier of Japan, was a ruthlessly ambitious upstart with no aristocratic pretensions. Oda Nobunaga was the son of a Owari province landowner who had inherited his father's lands as a 17-year-old in 1551. The endowment caused an immediate rift between his family members, but this mattered little to Nobunaga, who had a reputation for mulish and unruly behaviour. He is reported to have acted so badly at his father's funeral that an Oda retainer felt compelled to commit seppuku to rebuke him. Wow. This action seemed to focus Nobunaga's ambitions as the teenager set about conquering the splintered factions that made up Owari and unified the province under his rule as daimyo. Nobunaga's ascent to power was rapid and relentless, his methods cunning, efficient, and brutal, but he was not the only regional daimyo with aspirations. In fact, compared with the mighty samurai houses of the mid-16th century, Hojo, Takeda, Yoseki, and Imagawa, the Oda clan was a mere minnow amongst piranhas. Of these rivals, Nobunaga's greatest foe was Imagawa Yoshimoto, and in 1554 he was a cultivated 35-year-old daimyo at the peak of his career. The Imagawa could trace its lineage back to the mighty Tada clan, and Yoshimoto was directly related to the heroes of the Genpei War. Under his control were the Mikawa, Totomi, and Suruoka provinces, which as fate would have it lay directly next to the Oda province of Owari. Yoshimoto planned to invade Owari, but this was not his main goal. He intended to march on Kyoto itself and become the first regional daimyo to seize the coveted, although largely empty, title of shogun. So by 1558, Yoshimoto had started attacking Nobunaga's fortresses along the border. In charge of these frontier skirmishes was one of Yoshimoto's rising stars, a 17-year-old samurai called Tokugawa Ieyasu. 17 years old, wow. Ieyasu was to be the last of the great unifiers of Japan. His reign followed that of Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a young samurai who was also involved in the conflict between the Imagawa and the Oda. But unlike Ieyasu, Hideyoshi was fighting on the side of Nobunaga. Here his guile and unflinching loyalty led to a rapid rise through the ranks unmatched by any other samurai. Hideyoshi's ascent also represents the pinnacle of Gekokujo achievement. He was born the son of a simple Owari peasant, whose main ambition for his son was to join the priesthood, and instead Hideyoshi absconded from the monastery and became a foot soldier in the Owari army. After stealing money to buy armor, Hideyoshi managed to join those fighting directly under Nobunaga. He was, for a time, the daimyo's sandal-bearer. Hideyoshi's fearlessness and cunning in battle soon caught Nobunaga's eye, and in a short time he became one of the daimyo's leading generals. Here we have the old provinces of Japan. The 16th century clan domains. Those clans that bordered a powerful and ambitious neighbour and could cause to worry during the Sengoku Jidai. So many regions. Hideyoshi would play a big role in defending the Owari province against Imagawa Yoshimoto's army, as the daimyo tried to push through to Kyoto. Owari was the first of 3 provinces that Yoshimoto would need to cross to reach the capital, and with a 40,000-strong samurai army, it's unlikely he considered Nobunaga a serious threat. The events began on a summer's day in June 1560, when news reached Nobunaga at his Kyosu castle that one of his outlying fortresses had been overrun. The Imagawa attack, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, had come at dawn and relied heavily on arquebus fire. Only hours later, reports indicated that a second fortress had fallen. The sheer numbers of the enemy force, combined with the ferocity of the fighting, suggested an all-out invasion rather than another traditional skirmish on the province's periphery. So the Battle of Okehazama. Here are the grave of Imagawa Yoshimoto here. He was the first daimyo to understand Oda Nobunaga, underestimate Oda Nobunaga, his younger neighbour. The 1560 Battle of Okehazama would be Yoshimoto's undoing. The Battle of Okehazama. So as Nobunaga approached Okehazama, he sent scouts ahead, and in his army's camp in a forested gorge, Imagawa Yoshimoto was enjoying the traditional ritual of viewing the heads of enemies taken from the Oda fortresses. Very pleasant. Each head had a label giving the samurai's name as well as the name of the warrior who had killed him. So far the victories against the Oda had been well won, and Yoshimoto was pleased. A mood of celebration reigned at the Imagawa camp. After several hours of sake consumption, there was something of a carnival atmosphere. Meanwhile, Nobunaga led his troops to a nearby hill where they built a decoy camp, complete with banners and flags. The intention was to keep the Imagawa's eye distracted while the Oda planned a surprise attack. It was a hot and sticky day in Owari, and in the early afternoon a thunderstorm broke. The subsequent downpour provided the perfect cover for Nobunaga and his men, who approached the Imagawa camp with stealth and speed. As the rain lifted, the Oda samurai charged at the Imagawa, who were so shocked and unprepared that many simply ran for the hills. Yoshimoto himself was napping in his tent when he was roused by the commotion outside. Thinking it was the sound of his own men's revelries, Yoshimoto stormed from his tent to call for quiet. As he did so, he met an Oda samurai rushing at him with a spear. As he fumbled for his sword, another Oda retainer beheaded Yoshimoto. Now leaderless, the Imagawa force melted away, leaving dozens of fallen samurai behind. What an incredibly dramatic scenario. That's very Game of Thrones-esque, isn't it? Interrupting celebrations. More wonderful imagery here, look at this. These are our arquebusiers, which would sometimes cover their matchlock mechanism with a lacquered box so they could fire in the rain. Smart. And the sword bow and naginata were the traditional weapons of the samurai. Here they are styled by Minamoto Yoshitsune and the warrior monk Benkei. That's a naginata. So Nobunaga commanded an army of only 2,000 samurai, which meant the Imagawa outnumbered him by 20 to 1. Nevertheless, the extreme odds did not seem to dampen the daimyo's mood, and he hummed merrily to himself as he led his army towards the Imagawa force encamped in a gorge near the small village of Okayazama. The Battle of Okayazama lasted only a matter of minutes, but it was a pivotal point in Nobunaga's rise to power. It also allied him with Tokugawa Ieyasu, who defected to Nobunaga alongside hundreds of other defeated Imagawa warriors and brought his name to the attention of the emperor. The victory at Okayazama represented Gekokuju at its finest and most practical. Nobunaga, a simple landowner's son, had defeated the army of an experienced aristocratic daimyo at the head of a vastly superior force. Nobunaga had shown that being without the necessary pedigree was no obstacle to success. Naked ambition, strategic cunning, and complete ruthlessness could now win the day. The tradition of mounted duels between gentlemen warriors was over. Now a large army of Ashikaru foot soldiers going arquebuses would determine success in war, and the strategic use of arquebuses on the battlefield was Nobunaga's specialty. So interesting, isn't it, how so much of the formation of the modern world that we have is before this time the domain of gentlemen, so to speak, who would act war out in almost like a chess-like fashion. All a game. So the use of firearms was unknown in a warrior nation centered on the sword. And in fact, the samurai's introduction to this revolutionary weapon came about by accident. So in 1543, a fleet of Portuguese merchants were caught in a storm and washed up on the rocky Japanese island of Tanegashima, south of Kyushu. The shipwreck would have been unremarkable if not for the arquebuses these soldiers were carrying. The samurai had experienced gunpowder before because Mongol invaders had put it to deadly use when attacking Japan in the 13th century. But the power of gunpowder harnessed in a small portable weapon was something new and of great interest to the local Tanegashima daimyo. After lessons in the gun's manufacturer, Tanegashima swordsmiths set about producing large quantities of arquebuses. So the introduction of the arquebus onto the battlefield was controversial. To veteran samurai warriors, the weapon seemed to contravene every rule of warfare which they had lived and died. After all, they spent their entire lives perfecting the art of battle and training for an honourable death by the sword. But now they could be brought down by a weapon that an ashiguru could be trained to use in a single day. The arquebus meant the lowest-ranking member of a samurai army could use the weapon to kill a high-ranking warrior who until recently could often trace his lineage to the original aristocrat samurai of Japan. But this was the new way of war. Armies would still be led by mounted samurai leaders, but the use of bows and arrows would be slowly replaced by guns, stockades, and formidable stone fortresses. The young daimyo leading the way in all of these innovations of war was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga realized the importance of the arquebus in battle. He did not use the weapon just to supplement his backline of archers as the older daimyo Takeda Shingen had done. Instead, Nobunaga used the guns up front, in rotating lines of ashikaru shielded from an enemy assault by a fence or stockade. The weapon led to great carnage on the battlefield and ensured the strength of Nobunaga's army. To ensure a constant supply line of guns, gunpowder, and ammunition, Nobunaga began seizing ports that traded with foreign countries and towns containing silver mines. Now that he had the weaponry, Nobunaga's campaign for power began in earnest. The ideology of his long march to Kyoto and the unification of Japan's regional clans was simple. Take what you need, join with willing clans, and eliminate any that stand in your way. Yoshiaki here was the last Ashikaga shogun and a puppet of Oda Nobunaga. He was forced to find a sympathetic champion to try and seize control. So Nobunaga's policy of conquest and control acquired a certain legitimacy when Emperor Ogamachi wrote a letter referring to him as the famous general with no peer in any age. After the flattery came a request for a favour, as Ogamachi asked Nobunaga to recover the imperial holdings Akimachi also wondered if Nobunaga could help out financially with repairs on the imperial palace. There were further requests for help, this time from Ashikaga Yoshiaki, brother of the murdered shogun and rightful heir to the title. Yoshiaki had appealed for help in the past from any daimyo that he considered had the strength of arms to support him, and in the end it was Nobunaga who heeded Yoshiaki's call. Nobunaga was not of aristocratic blood, and so could not become shogun, but he could certainly become the power behind one, and the Ashikaga had many years of practice as shogunal puppets. In 1568, Nobunaga plucked Yoshiaki from his hideaway in the province of Echizen and marched with him at the head of a large army towards Kyoto. On the way, he conquered parts of Ise, Iga, and Omi, and the reigning shogun and the Matsunaga clan, pulling his strings, fled Kyoto as soon as Nobunaga approached. Yoshiaki was quickly made the 15th and last Ashikaga shogun. At the beginning, there were promising signs for Yoshiaki, whose main aim was to restore the shogunate to its true glory. From the outset, he acted like the man in charge. He sued daimyos for peace and attempted to recover imperial landholdings and estates, and it also appeared that Nobunaga was supporting Yoshiaki's position. He built the shogun a large and lavish castle in Kyoto that boasted moats, bridges, stone towers, and ostentatious interior fittings. But trouble was coming. Yoshiaki was sent 16 statues by Nobunaga, one of which stated that the shogun must adopt without any question any policy put forward by Nobunaga. Access to the shogun was also to be restricted. Warriors, daimyos, and leaders from religious sects would be forbidden an audience with Yoshiaki. Things went on in this manner until in 1570, Nobunaga heard that Yoshiaki was planning a revolt. Nobunaga turned the screw with another set of shogunal orders. One of the new statutes read, "Since the affairs of the realm have in fact been put in Nobunaga's hands, Nobunaga may take measures against anyone whatsoever, according to his own discretion, and without the need to obtain the shogun's agreement." In other words, Nobunaga was now free to do whatever he liked, to whomever, whenever he pleased. The gloves were off, and Nobunaga's ambition stood plain. Between 1570 and 1573, Nobunaga went to war with 6 samurai houses: the Asakura, Asai, Takeda, Rakaku, Miyoshi, and Matsunga. Leading his numerous campaigns during this time were his 2 greatest generals, Hideyoshi and Ieyasu. But despite their brilliance, Nobunaga was fighting on several different fronts, and his army was stretched. One recurring thorn in Nobunaga's side was the Iko-Iki, who had built the temples and fortresses in Owari, Kaga, Echizen, and other strategic locations in the provinces surrounding Kyoto. The Iko-Iki were a threat through their political and economic influence as well as their military clout. They had allied themselves with almost all of Nobunaga's enemies, and there was an Iko-Iki stronghold near every major trade route. One of the Iko-Iki's allies was a much older order of warrior monks. The Enryakuji had a well-established history of agitation and rebellion against ruling factions, including the Oda. Now, Nobunaga decides to make an example of them. In 1571, 30,000 of Nobunaga's samurai marched on the monastery at Mount Hiei in what was to become one of his most brutal and infamous acts. In the dead of the night, the warriors encircled the monastery at dawn and entered the fortress and put all to the fire and sword, recorded Portuguese missionary Louis Fro. This was wholesale butchery, with men, women, and children beheaded where they stood or lay. Nobunaga's men made sure none hid or escaped, and afterwards set fire to the entire monastery, burning down over 2,000 buildings. Wow, that is absolutely brutal. Back in Kyoto, Ashikaga Yoshiaki had found a sympathetic daimyo to champion his cause against the oppressor Oda Nobunaga. Takeda Shingen was a one-time ally of Nobunaga, who now broke the terms of their union and made ready to march a formidable army of 20,000 samurai on Kyoto. But standing between Shinken and his quarry was Hamamatsu Castle, the headquarters of the Tokugawa Ieyasu. Shinken's troops outnumbered Ieyasu's by 3 to 1, but buoyed by 3,000 reinforcements from Nobunaga and his own unshakable self-belief, Ieyasu decided to meet Shinken on the plain of Mikatagahara for a pitched battle. So it was on that afternoon of 25th of January 1573, as the snow began to fall, two facing lines of warriors came together like the samurai armies of old. Shinken organized his forward line into a fish-scale formation, while Ieyasu opted for that of a stork's wing, which maximized the use of arquebus fire along its front line. While the arquebus is largely considered the battlefield game-changer of 16th century Japanese warfare, it would be outdone at the Mikatagahara by an old-fashioned samurai cavalry charge. The arquebus Ashigaru at the center of Ieyasu's front line were completely overrun by the horsemen, while his flanks only just managed to hold themselves in a wing formation. A second charge, this time led by Takeda Katsuyori, threw Ieyasu's army into disarray, forcing Ieyasu himself to flee. As Ieyasu rode back to the safety of Hamamatsu Castle, rumours quickly circulated that the day was lost. The castle's inhabitants began preparing to strengthen the walls for the inevitable Takeda siege, but Ieyasu ordered the gates to be kept open and the torches lit inside to guide back his retreating army. Ieyasu's tactic, known as the empty fort strategy, bewildered the Takeda army as it approached the castle and made Shinken suspect a trap. Instead of attacking the castle, which would have easily been overrun, the Takeda stopped and pitched camp for the night a short distance from its walls. Some accounts report that during the night, the Takeda camp was infiltrated by Oda ninjas, who killed some prominent samurai and threw the camp into confusion. Other accounts say that the Shinken was brought news of an imminent force made up of Nobunaga and Yusei Kenshin samurai that far outnumbered his own. Whatever the reason, something persuaded Shinken to call off his attack on Hamamatsu Castle and retreat. Takeda Shinken would have one attempt at an all-out attack on Kyoto, this time at the front of an army made up of Takeda, Asai, Asakura, and Iki warriors. Here's the Battle of Mikatagahara that proved that a cavalry charge could outdo a line of firing arquebusiers, which is staged in Kurosawa's film Ran. And here is the battle. Pitted one time, Nobunaga allied Takeda Shinken against the formidable Tokugawa Ieyasu. It's quite an ingenious strategy, isn't it? Just to flee and then leave your castle's doors open, and then stop your enemy in its tracks by thinking it's a trap. On that strategic genius, we will put a pin in our exploration of the unification of Japan. I very much look forward to having you join me next time for this fascinating look through the elite warrior history